Oke, halo teman-teman semuanya di rumah, dimanapun dan kapanpun. Kita next untuk part 2 dari Mysterious Affair Styles. Yang kesabaran, dengerin baik-baik ya. Come on, continue. Detective Poirot is sure that the drift of wax occurred in the early hours of the morning of Mrs. Inglethorpe's death and left a mark on the carpet, but if the drift had been there for a long time, then Mrs. Inglethorpe would have asked her maid of the house to clean it. Hastings also remembers that Lawrence lit a candle early in the morning for lighting, but it was a different candle because the color of the candle that Lawrence threw in the drops of wax the carpet had a different color. Only the candle that Lawrence broke was pink, while the drop of wax on the carpet was white. Detective Poirot was intrigued by the fireplace and examined. He finds a burnt scrap of paper, and Hastings believes that it is part of an important letter belonging to Mrs. Inglethorpe. Detective Poirot then interviewed the maid Dorcas at Mrs. Inglethorpe's house and asked about the green cloth he had found earlier, and the Dorcas said that no one had any green cloth in the house. Dorcas then admitted that at around 4 p.m. he heard the sound of a quarrel between Mrs. Inglethorpe and a man in Mrs. Inglethorpe's room. Then at 5 p.m., Dorcas delivered tea to Mrs. Inglethorpe, but Dorcas saw her daydreaming while holding the inheritance letter, and Mrs. Inglethorpe said, "Scandal between husband and wife is a very terrible thing, and the letter that Mrs. Inglethorpe is holding escaped back to the purple box. Mrs. Inglethorpe didn't take her sleeping pill last night, and she has not taken them for 2 days." Evelyn or Evie then returned to Styles Court, sad by the death of her friend Mrs. Inglethorpe. Mr. John introduced Detective Poirot to Evelyn, but Evelyn immediately says that Mr. Albert was the one who killed Mrs. Inglethorpe and insists on punishing Mr. Alfred as soon as possible for the murder of Mrs. Inglethorpe. Hastings and the detective then returned to Mrs. Inglethorpe's room to check Mrs. Inglethorpe's letters. Then Poirot told Hastings the next piece of evidence, which was Mrs. Inglethorpe's medicine box, which was empty. Mr. John then came and said Mr. Wells, a lawyer, Mrs. Inglethorpe, had arrived. Detective Poirot also checked by inheritance, and Mr. Wells also informed him that according to the will he received 2 months before Mrs. Inglethorpe's death, only 2 people had 2 inheritance. First, Mr. John Cavendish got a house in Styles Court and a house in London. Second, Mr. Albert Inglethorpe got a much large residual wealth and then the inheritance that Mr. John has. The detective then informed that it was possible that Mr. Inglethorpe wrote a new will based on a piece of the letter she had found in the fireplace earlier. Then Mr. John Hastings, Mr. Wells, and Detective Poirot examined Mrs. Inglethorpe's study, room. Mr. Wells informed that it is possible that Mrs. Inglethorpe met a new will because of an argument with a man believed to Mrs. Albert. They went to Mrs. Inglethorpe's room and found that the purple CD that Detective Poirot had looked earlier was unlocked, and it turned out that the purple box had been forcibly broken into by someone. Detective Poirot also checked the door connected to Cynthia's room, and it was not locked, and it was believed that the thief had entered through the door. Hastings and Poirot went to lunch, and Poirot told Hastings that there were two important points in the case of the murder of Mrs. Inglethorpe. First, the weather condition on the day of Mrs. Inglethorpe's death. Second, Mr. Albert wore typical clothes, namely a distinctive beard and round glasses. Minutes later, detectives and Hastings attended the trial of Mrs. Inglethorpe at Stile Village Court. The judge asked Dr. Wilkins about Mrs. Inglethorpe's death, and Dr. Wilkins said that Mrs. Inglethorpe died from drinking a bout of the strychnine found in her stomach. There was no strychnine in Mrs. Inglethorpe's chocolate drink, and Dr. Wilkins was sure that Mrs. Inglethorpe was poisoned by the coffee she drank that night. Then Lauren was called as a witness and said that his stepmother's death occurred because of an overdose of Mrs. Inglethorpe's sleeping pills herself. And Mary is also called as the next witness and asked about the fight which was heard before, but she lied. The next witness was Mr. Mace, a drug dealer, and asked about someone who bought him strychnine the day before Mrs. Inglethorpe's death, and that person was Mr. Albert, with the excuse of poisoning dogs. Mr. Albert was then called and asked about the purchase of the drug. Mr. Albert denied that he didn't buy the drug because there was no dog in his house. Then he was shown the strychnine drug purchase book, and it turned out that there was Mr. Albert's name and signature in the book, but it didn't match Mr. Albert's signature. The result of the trial was determined that it was not Mr. Albert who killed Mrs. Inglethorpe. After the trial, Poirot went to the house of Mrs. Rex, a widow in the next village. When Poirot knocked on the door, Mr. John was already there, and Mr. John immediately fled through the back door for fear of being caught by Poirot. Mr. Albert has been arrested and will be temporarily exiled in Middlesbrough. At that moment, Poirot came and said not to arrest Albert, first because Poirot wanted to inquire about his whereabouts before his wife's death, and he refused to remember his whereabouts. Then Poirot informed that Mrs. Riggs saw Mr. Albert was in the dead so it was not Mr. Albert who bought the strychnine. In the morning, Mrs. Inglethorpe's funeral was held, and there the Dorcans told Poirot about the green coat asked earlier, that he remembered that Cynthia had a green dress. Then Hastings and Poirot checked the barn and found the green dress. Hastings also discovered a fake mustache that closely resembled Mr. Albert's. Mr. Albert and Mr. John are under arrest. Hastings and Poirot went to the Scottish court. Mr. John was asked to admit or not admit that he was the one who killed his stepmother. Mr. John didn't even admit it. However, Mr. John is accused of poisoning his stepmother by finding a bottle of strychnine in his room, and Mr. John remains in custody for the time being there. Detective Poirot went back to Mrs. Inglethorpe's room and asked the doctor if anyone had stayed in Mrs. Inglethorpe's room after she died, and it wasn't there. Poirot went to the pharmaceutical analysis and asked the specialist there to test a mixture of sleeping powder and Mrs. Inglethorpe's night medicines to be dissolved in water. Then Poirot asked everyone to come together in one room to present the solutions to the case of the death of Mrs. Inglethorpe. And to arrest the murderer, Poirot explained about the 6 pieces of evidence he found while solving the case. Regarding the green cloth, which turned out to be Mary Cavendish, which accidentally got stuck in the connecting room door. Mary wanted to know about her husband's affair with Mrs. Riggs and looked for evidence of it in Mrs. Inglethorpe's room, and accidentally left a candle mark that she was holding that night, and only Mrs. Inglethorpe knew about her husband's infidelity. Then Poirot made 2 important points in this case. First, the weather condition on the day of Mrs. Inglethorpe's murder, and secondly, Mr. Albert, who is wearing the typical clothes and glasses. It was Mr. John who burned the letter Poirot had found earlier for fear that it would reveal his affair with Mrs. Riggs. Mrs. Inglethorpe was not poisoned by coffee or Mrs. Inglethorpe's chocolate drink, but from a mixture of sleeping powder and night medicine Mrs. Inglethorpe in an aqueous solution, and it turned out that strychnine deposits appeared because the sleeping powder contained peroxide. Regarding the strychnine drug that was burned case earlier, it turns out that the killer had poured it only to trap Mr. John, because he preferred that Mr. Upchurch so that he would not be suspected, and the killer disguised himself as Mr. Albert to buy the strychnine. The killer is revealed, and she is Mr. Albert Inglethorpe and Mrs. Evelyn. It was Mr. Albert who came to Mrs. Inglethorpe's room to look for the letter that Mrs. Inglethorpe found in Mr. Albert's room, and he was planning to burn it, but he heard the footsteps of Poirot and the others, so he just tore it into 3 pieces and linked it to a white paper flower in the top fireplace. Evelyn admits that it was she and Albert who worked together to kill Mrs. Inglethorpe because she wanted to control all of her treasures, and that Evelyn had disguised herself as a fake Albert to buy the strychnine drug as a trap for Mr. John and the police. And it was Evelyn who mixed up Mrs. Inglethorpe's medicine, and he pretended to leave the house and hates Albert so as not to be suspected by anyone. Okay, that is the ending of the history mystery affair at Styles. Thank you so much.